Hi, and welcome to another edition of the Journal Club organized by the Spanish Foundation for Science and Technology, FECYT. Today's event will be in English, but if you prefer to watch the video in Spanish, you can find a link to the Spanish simultaneous translation in the description of this video. My name is Kira Keini. I'm a science communicator at FECYT, and I will be moderating today's event. And today we'll be discussing the importance of evaluating the impact of our science communication and outreach activities. There are a lot of techniques and strategies out there for communicating science in a clear, rigorous, and effective way, but the impact of our communication is considered to a much lesser extent. And the lack of impact evaluation makes it hard, if not impossible, for us to know whether our communication activities have been successful or not, and to make the needed changes for them to improve in the future. And during this event, we'll be looking into what kind of scientific evidence there is about impact evaluation and how we can translate this evidence into our everyday practices in science communication. And to clarify the scope of this discussion, we'll be talking both about impact about science communication, as well as specific outreach activities like events. And to start unpacking this topic, we'll first hear about a practical example of impact evaluation from an outreach event. El YAR Ciencia Soca is a science fair organized annually in Bilbao, Spain, showcasing science and technology projects developed by students between 12 to 18 years old, which they have developed in collaboration with scientists. And the aim of the fair is to provide young people with experiences and equal opportunities among science, and to bring STEM fields and science as a profession closer to them. And in this video testimonial, Daniel Solabarrieta, responsible for the El YAR Science Fair, shares the key findings from the evaluation they did for the fair last year in 2021 to better understand the impact of the event on its key audiences. And the audiences were the participating students of the science fair, their teachers, as well as the researchers that the students developed their projects with. And the science fair did this evaluation together with researchers from the Research Center for Science and Mathematics Education at the Autonomous University of Barcelona. So let's take a look at this video.
El objetivo de esta iniciativa es la de ofrecer un modelo de evaluación específica para las ferias de ciencia con perspectiva RRI, y lo hemos hecho en colaboración con el equipo de investigadoras del CRECIM. El método de evaluación utilizado ha estado basado en cuestionarios validados y en entrevistas, que lo hemos pasado antes de haber participado en una feria de ciencia y después, y lo hemos utilizado con alumnado, profesorado y personal investigador que suele acompañar en el desarrollo de sus proyectos científico-tecnológicos a los jóvenes. Los resultados señalan que el alumnado cree que lo que más les ha valido para aprender ha sido para trabajar en grupo, lo que no habían tenido en cuenta sus profesores y profesoras. Los profesores dicen que después de haber participado en la feria de ciencia se sienten mucho más capaces de acompañar a sus alumnos y alumnas a desarrollar proyectos de ciencia y tecnología, y el personal investigador dice que quiere involucrarse más en el acompañamiento de los trabajos, aunque también dicen que tienen alguna carencia formativa, sobre todo de cómo dirigirse a los jóvenes. En definitiva, lo que hemos visto ha sido que hay una visión diferente entre el alumnado, profesorado y personal investigador sobre la participación de las ferias de ciencia, y por ello se hace necesario utilizar herramientas más efectivas para medir el impacto que tienen estas actividades y mejorarlas.
Thank you, Daniel, for sharing your experiences with us. And to translate the content for our English-speaking audiences, in the video, Daniel explains that they wanted to provide a specific evaluation model for science fair with a focus on responsible research and investigation practices. They used both surveys and interviews before and after the event to evaluate the impact the science fair had on the participating students, teachers, and researchers. The students' responses indicated that the most useful aspect for them about the festival was to work on their projects in teams, which was something that the teachers and the researchers participating in the fair hadn't considered. The teachers' responses showed that as a result of their participation in the festival, they felt more confident in supporting their students to develop science-related projects. And the responses of the researchers revealed that although they enjoyed collaborating with the students, they felt that they lacked specific training regarding how to best work with the students and help them with their projects. And Danielle says that these results provide useful information for the festival on how to further develop and improve their activities and engage the different audiences participating in the event in the future. And to get started with today's discussion, we're joined by Eric Jensen, who is Associate Professor of Sociology at the University of Warwick in the United Kingdom and Civic Science Fellow at the University of Illinois in the United States. Eric's work focuses on evidence-based science communication, and he's internationally known for his work on the impact evaluation of science communication and the development of evaluation methodology for the same. So welcome, Eric.
Yeah.
And as usual, my colleague Bruno Martin from ScienceLead will join in the conversation with insights from complementary papers and share with us any questions or comments that you write on YouTube or Twitter during the event. And please feel free to write in both Spanish or English as you wish in both YouTube and Twitter to join in the conversation. Welcome, Bruno.
Thank you, Kira. Yes, I'll be watching the YouTube chat and Twitter, so let me know all your questions. I'll pose them to our expert.
Perfect. Thank you, Bruno. Okay, so to get started with today's main article, the article we'll be focusing on today is written by our guest speaker, Eric, and it's called Why Impact Evaluation Matters in Science Communication, or Advancing the Science of Science Communication. It's a chapter in the book Science Communication in South Africa, Reflections on Current Issues, which was published in 2019 by African Minds and edited by Peter Weingart, Marina Jobert, and Pankol Falal. And Eric, in this article, you write about the lack of good impact evaluation practices in science communication, which, as you put it, makes it impossible for us to know what counts as successful public engagement activity. And before we get deeper into discussing the article, I think it's useful to clarify the key concept we'll be repeating during the event. So what do we talk about when we talk about impact, particularly in science communication?
Sure. Yeah, impact is the difference that we make in the world. So how are people who attend a science communication event or view something online, how are they different because they've had that experience? So because they've encountered the science communication, do they have a different attitude or interest? Have they learned something? Just how are they different? And it is worth keeping in mind that people can be different in a bad way also. So it is possible that somebody is, for example, more confused after they've watched a bad video explaining something, attempting to explain something. So the difference that you see in people is what we mean by impact.
Perfect. So the results of what we do in the people that we're communicating to, right?
Exactly.
And at the beginning of your article, you write, low quality evaluation evidence, as well as the absence of evaluation or evidence-based design of science communication initiatives, has been setting up the global enterprise of science communication for failure over many years. Science communication practitioners are rarely trained to be able to distinguish good from bad evaluation methods, and science communication institutions, including funders, are generally uncritical consumers and producers of evaluation research. So why do you think this is? Given that evaluation monitoring are so central for scientific research, why hasn't much or enough attention has been put into this in science communication?
Yeah, I think that there are a few reasons why this is the case, good reasons. So a lot of science communication is done by people who are coming to science communication from science, so from natural science or physical sciences. And that means that they may not have gotten training in something like, how do you write a good survey? How do you do a qualitative interview? These are things that you are not typically trained in when you are studying natural science or chemistry or these kinds of topics. And often people go directly from those kinds of disciplines into science communication, which is more of a social science endeavor. And in particular, evaluation is basically a social science research method. So it's something that if you're coming from sociology, for example, you would actually have a better set of tools from your undergraduate training than you would if you come from chemistry or astronomy or some other kind of science. So I think it's reasonable that people don't have these skills already when they enter science communication. The problem is that we don't have a good way of getting people skilled up in these elements, in these kinds of important tasks, and yet people are expected to do them. So there's this gap between expectation and what people actually have the training to do, and that's never good in any professional field.
Definitely. And as you write in your paper, you say that training in social research methods would really be helpful. And it's an important part of enhancing the practice of measuring impacts in science communication. But you also call out that the key starting point would be to set realistic and clear objectives for our activities. So this would enable us to assess our success and design better activities in the future. So where should we start to design impact evaluation? How do we decide on good objectives for our activities?
Yeah, I mean, where you can make the most difference for improving science communication is basically the most early in the process possible. And that is when you start thinking about what is the point of this activity at all? Is this the right thing to be doing? Are we going about it in the right way? So the kind of strategy for science communication is the first most fundamental step. And in order to decide what is the most appropriate communication strategy, you have to be very clear about the objectives for that communication activity. So you have to clarify the nature of the impact that you're targeting in order to be able to decide what is the best way to go about achieving those objectives. That then also lays the foundation for good impact evaluation, because if you're clear about what you're trying to achieve, then it is also a more natural step to how do we evaluate whether that's actually happened.
Right. Well, is there any possibility of measuring impact if we don't have any objectives in place? So kind of starting from the other end, is that even a possibility?
It is technically possible to go directly to just kind of an exploratory assessment of what did people think of this activity, what did they take away. So for a qualitative evaluation, it could be possible to evaluate impact without having full clarity about the objectives. But if you want to do a quantitative evaluation with surveys, for example, you do have to be very specific about the nature of the impact that's intended. Otherwise, you can't design appropriate survey questions to measure those outcomes.
All right. Well, as you already said, and as you write in this main article today, you write that impact of science communication in our audiences can mean about, for example, them learning about a topic or having more interest towards something or changing their attitudes. So how is this different from our audiences self-evaluating themselves?
Yeah, directly evaluating impact is a really important thing in designing impact evaluation. So self-reported impact, this is if you have somebody explain to you what difference this activity made for them. So for example, if you ask them, did you learn today? Or how much did your attitudes change today? This is asking them to do a kind of analysis for you to assess for themselves what kind of changes occurred. And it's not a very realistic thing to expect people to do, because it requires a lot of cognitive effort, a lot of thinking to be able to do that kind of self-assessment. So the appropriate way to do robust impact evaluation is to directly measure the outcomes that you're interested in. For example, directly measuring attitudes or interests or what somebody knows about a topic before and after, and then comparing the difference between the two. So as the evaluator, doing that comparison to see how have people changed, rather than expecting your participant to do an analysis for you.
All right. Well, how reliable would you say that impacts evaluation in these kinds of cases where the data is coming from the audience, of course, the basis of impact evaluation in science communication? Should we also aim to combine this with other evaluation methods?
I mean, there are a range of evaluation methods available. The most appropriate method will depend on what is the intended impact, but also on the skills and capabilities and resources of the evaluator. So, for example, it might be ideal to do a really in-depth qualitative evaluation, but you might not have the time and the resources to do it. So you just have to kind of do what you can in the time available. There are alternatives to collecting data directly from respondents. For example, you can do observations, so structured observation where you count, for example, how many times somebody stops in front of an exhibit, how long they stay there, what kind of behaviors they exhibit, do they like point at something. You can do those kinds of more objective analyses. It is possible, and they can play a useful role, particularly in the museum context. That kind of approach is widely used. But in general, most impact evaluation will use either surveys or qualitative interviews. I would say more than 90% of the cases, that's what would be used.
For example, in the video that we saw with Danielle, this was exactly the case. Now that you mentioned the available resources that us who are evaluating the impact of our activities have, ideally, of course, we'd use scientifically valid evaluation methods. Of course, we need the specific training for that, but how would you advise our viewers? There are many people who probably are lacking either time or the capabilities or the money. Where can we make compromises? What can we, how can we like streamline this process from our end?
Yeah, there are a lot of good options for shortcuts that do not reduce the quality of the work. I mean, actually, that's also the case for social research in general. So I wrote a research methods textbook called Doing Real Research that kind of explains some of the shortcuts you can make in social research in general. So that's surveys, interviews, focus groups. For example, instead of transcribing, of writing down everything somebody says in an interview, you can select the relevant parts first and then focus your analysis around just the relevant parts, so that you save time on data management with a qualitative evaluation. With a survey, that you can save some time at the survey design stage by drawing from an existing, already validated set of survey questions. So I don't recommend getting those questions from existing practice. So, you know, like don't borrow them from the British Science Festival or something like that. But where you can borrow them from is from the large scale public attitudes to science surveys that are done, where they have the time and the resources invested in testing the quality of those survey questions in advance. They might not fit perfectly, so you might need to adapt those questions, but that will already give you a big head start compared to trying to just come up with questions from nothing, where there's a big risk that you just get it completely wrong. Whereas if you start from existing questions that have already been validated from surveys like the Wellcome Global Monitor, for example, which has survey questions available in a lot of different languages and has been tested with a lot of resources, that gives you a really good starting point. And if you need to tweak the questions, you're still probably going to be fine.
Perfect, thank you. We'll make sure to include the book you just mentioned in the newsletter we'll be sending out after this event. All right, well, impact isn't necessarily always linear or immediate. It can take time before we see the impact of our science communication activities, and there might be many steps along the way towards our end goal. So if we take the objective of achieving behavioral change, for example, if we think about a recent example from the pandemic or encouraging people to get their COVID vaccines, it's not enough that the message you need to get vaccinated is communicated by public health authorities for it to have the desired impact. And on screen, we have an illustration of this chain of actions. So the message first has to be heard by our audience, then understood, then agreed on, which could lead to action. And in some cases, acting once isn't enough. We need the action to be done various times, as people, in the case of vaccinations, need to get the booster vaccines. So being able to identify these different steps along the way can also help us locate where our science communication or public engagement activities have gone wrong and where along the way we haven't been able to move on to the next step. So Eric, I wanted to ask you if you could give us any examples on how these different steps could be measured in science communication. How can we ensure that we are getting the desired impacts, like behavioral change, for example?
Yeah, what you've shown here is actually a really good example of what should ideally be done when you're designing science communication initiatives, that you should think about what are the steps required for people to get to where we want to in the end, because it's rarely a direct one step equals the outcome that you want. There's often a whole chain of events that need to happen. And there is a kind of method for setting this out. It's called a theory of change, and setting up a theory of change for how you think the intervention, the steps that you're doing will lead to the outcomes that you want. That's a really useful thing to do at the beginning when you're setting out your science communication strategy. So it can help you to refine your strategy, but then it also can be useful when it comes time for the impact evaluation, because those steps that you mentioned are each things that can be measured. So we can see where we are losing people, for example. If it's at the point of they didn't listen, is it at the point of they didn't understand? Is it at the point that they didn't agree? Is it at the action point? So this is really useful to know, because the whole point of evaluation is to adjust your approach to do things differently the next time. And if you only know that it worked or it didn't work, and you don't know why, you don't know where it went wrong, then you can't make the adjustments you need to do things better the next time and to be more effective the next time. So it is important that impact evaluations do not only focus on the end goal. They also get at what are those steps along the way, and are those steps being met, so that you can inform your future intervention.
Definitely. And we've mentioned a bunch of times the fact that with measuring impacts, we can improve in the future. As the organizers of the science fair in Evaluar are doing hopefully this year and the coming years. But how about in cases in which the event or activity is a one-time only thing? Are there any differences between continuous or repeated and then these one-time only events?
Yeah, I mean, it is a different calculation that you have to make. Also, you have to think about how long is the activity itself that people are exposed to when you think about the measurement approach. Like, you don't want to take a 2-minute video and then ask somebody to complete a 15-minute survey about it. It's not balanced. So these are things to keep in mind. When it's only a one-time activity, I tend to think more about what's called formative evaluation. So doing evaluation before the activity actually takes place, maybe having a focus group, doing something to inform the design of the activity, especially if it's going to be like a one-time but very high stakes, a lot of people exposed to the activity, then it's a good idea to invest your effort at the beginning. If it's a repeated activity, then you can benefit from testing, improving, like a kind of traditional impact evaluation kind of virtuous cycle of practice, improvement, evaluation, improvement, that kind of thing. So yeah, each of these things have to be taken into account in the evaluation design. And that means that you can't have a one-size-fits-all model for evaluation. You always have to take into account the context of the actual activity itself, of the audiences, and where is the best opportunity to collect data from them. So it's a kind of creative activity to decide where can you fit evaluation into the process in a way that will make the most benefit for the activity and ultimately for the audiences, which is the point.
Mm-hmm. Did you say formative evaluation for the one time? Do you have any concrete examples of kind of evaluation?
Yeah, so actually for one of the projects that I'm working on right now that's kind of coming up, so I'm a civic science fellow at the Advanced Visualization Lab at the University of Illinois. They make data visualizations that are pretty expensive to make. They're a big investment, and they set them, basically they take scientific data and then they put it to a level of visualization that it can go into documentary films like a big screen dome films and planetariums. So they don't have the opportunity to do that over and over again. They have to get it right the first time. So what we're doing there is I'm convening focus groups with a set of different types of audiences. So 3 very different categories of audience. And we're testing out different options with them in advance, getting their feedback, understanding their perspectives about what's working or not and why. And then that will feed into the design of this visualization, which once it's finished, we really can't do anything about it. So we just have to wait for the next documentary film, which could be a year or 2 later. So that's an example where it's kind of high stakes and it's not feasible to iterate and improve each time. We've got to front load the evaluation and get it right the first time.
Perfect. Thank you for that example. That illustrates well what we're talking about. At this point, I would like for Bruno to join the conversation. You had some interesting papers actually from Eric that you wanted to share with us.
Yeah, for sure. Actually, I think this really ties in well with what Eric was explaining now, because I wanted to comment first on one of the papers we've included in the newsletter that hopefully some of you have been able to check out in advance. And this is a paper called Evaluating Children's Conservation Biology Learning at the Zoo. And it was published in the journal Conservation Biology in 2014. And the author is Eric Jensen. So if you have any questions about the paper, feel free to shoot now. And Eric, do correct me if I'm misrepresenting any of your research. But I found it really interesting because in this study, we start from the assumption that zoos should have among their aims to promote conservation biology. So in this paper, you used pre- and post-visit questionnaires to evaluate whether children are actually learning about conservation biology during their visits. In this case, I think it was the London Zoo. And these are children age 7 to 15. So the paper compares the learning outcomes from guided and unguided zoo visits based on children's annotated drawings of habitats and lists of zoo-related thoughts. So this is an interesting method as well, because you're taking a qualitative data source, which is drawings. Like in principle, you wouldn't think you'd be able to evaluate, whether specific goals have been met from a drawing, but then you're turning them into quantitative data via content analysis of specific elements of those drawings, I'm guessing. So what we found interesting about this paper, and the reason we wanted to highlight it, even though you've published further papers about learning at zoos since, is that it hints at that thing that you were talking about at the very beginning of the event today, which is negative impact. This paper demonstrates that not only were there some positive impacts, but also that certain types of zoo visits, specifically the unguided ones, led to more negative outcomes than in the guided zoo visits. So your research in this case suggests that unguided interpretative materials found in zoos are maybe not the best way to support conservation biology learning. And this whole concept that by doing some kind of science communication activity, in this case a zoo visit, but maybe it could have been a video or it could have been a public outreach talk or anything, that the fact that we need to contemplate that it can lead to negative impacts is at first a bit counterintuitive. So I wanted to ask you a bit more about that. Is it likely that we are missing perhaps negative impact of our communication in other contexts because we don't anticipate them, or that we don't account for them in our impact analysis methodologies, even if we know that they're a possibility? Can you tell us a bit more about that?
Yeah, so I think you're absolutely right that it often does not occur to science communicators that what they're doing could have a negative impact. And I get that because, as a university professor, I rarely think about the idea that the way I'm presenting content could have a negative impact on the students' learning. But from an evaluation perspective, we absolutely have to account for that possibility. because we cannot assume going into an evaluation that results are going to be either positive or negative. We should have as our default assumption nothing, like no effect at all. And then I am kind of surprised either way. So if there's an effect on the positive side, if there's an effect on the negative side, they're both like, oh, that's interesting. My default expectation is always nothing, that it just has no effect. And so that's the kind of reasonable approach from an evaluation perspective. It is worth trying to think about the risks, the downside risks for negative impact at some point in the process of designing a science communication activity. In some cases, there are more red flags than others. So for example, in this space around conservation communication, there are known risks that in the research literature that, for example, if you talk a lot about the negative aspects and you kind of make people really sad and upset, so this can happen with global warming discussions, climate change, that kind of thing as well, that you need to give people some way back out of that negative emotion. So you need to give them something tangible, something specific and actionable at the individual level that they can do to feel better about the situation. If you just leave them feeling bad, you actually kind of make the situation worse. That's what the research has shown in the context of climate change communication. So in those cases, you should be extra attentive to the risk of negative impact. But in general, it's always worth thinking about at some point in the process. Obviously, you don't want to kind of spend all of your time thinking about the downside risks, but at some point thinking about, okay, what are the downsides here? How could this go wrong? How could people misunderstand what we're talking about here? So this kind of perspective taking or empathy for thinking about different kinds of audiences other than your ideal perfect audience that like understands everything the first time exactly like you intended, it's a useful exercise to kind of game out those possibilities, the negative impact possibilities, so that you can avoid them happening in the first place. And right. I have seen that where there were kind of predictable risks, downside risks that could be blocked by making different choices in the science communication.
And what's the way that we could anticipate those kind of risks then, depending on, the specific area of science that we work in and we want to communicate? Is it, maybe like literature review of known risks, like you were saying, like in the case of climate change, I know that there are many documented ones. I'm assuming that health also has lots of backfire effects that are well known about. But if there isn't much literature, what can one do to anticipate the stuff that could go wrong?
I mean, that's where evaluation comes in. So the ideal way that this works for evidence-based science communication is that you use the literature, use the research to the extent you can. You have a good theoretical basis for thinking that A is likely to lead to B, that kind of thing. But ultimately, where the gaps are, if you're doing something new, if you're doing something with a new kind of audience, that's where you use evaluation to fill in that new information. So when you're kind of breaking new ground with your science communication activity, you should be thinking in particular in those cases about the importance of having evaluation in place to make sure that things not only are going like excellent and you're getting all the positives that you want, but also that you're picking up if there are any problems, that you're seeing those. Because if you're kind of walking into new territory, you're also kind of walking onto thin ice, and the risk of things going wrong is greater.
Right.
Eric, I wanted to ask about this paper. If we talk about the methods, you were evaluating the drawings made by the children. How did you come up with this method?
Yeah, it was because it was in London, and I noticed in my kind of initial observations that a lot of the children were speaking English as a second language. And I looked up the statistics. It's about 30% of children in London are coming to this from a different language. So I did not want a method of evaluation that relied too heavily on their English language capability. So the drawings occurred to me as an option that would put more emphasis on something that was non-linguistic and therefore would take less, take some of the pressure off of their English capabilities. Also, they were young, so they're even under the best of circumstances, language was going to be a challenge. So that was the main reason. And in the other parts of this evaluation project, it was a big 2-year project at London Zoo. And one of the other elements was doing evaluation with very young children, so down to age 5. So there, it was not feasible to use surveys. So I did focus groups, and I still wanted to have a method that did not rely on the talking part too heavily. So I brought objects and kind of Play-Doh for them to be able to make shapes and show me things visually as part of the focus group. So in general, it was a way of coping with the specifics of that category of audience.
Very interesting. It's a perfect example of kind of putting yourself in your audience's shoes as well, to being able to measure the impact in the best possible way. So coming back to the idea of negative impact. So in the main paper, you write that a common problem in science communication is that often we put emphasis on the outputs that we produce, what we have done as communicators, instead of looking into how our audiences are benefiting. So if we do this and assume that our work is having the impact that we wish for, we might be neglecting the possibility of negative impacts. So how do we kind of balance this, our goals, what we want to achieve, and then how it is benefiting or affecting our audiences? What would you say to that?
Yeah, I mean, both of those elements are relevant, important. They both matter. Like what the science communicator wants to get out of this is important. So the step that you should do is to separate those dimensions. So to clarify, the participants will get X and Y and Z out of this experience from what the organizers need to get out of the experience and what the organizers will do. So there's a tool called a logic model that's used when planning programs and events. And in the logic model, you separate outputs, which is what you're doing, what you're kind of putting out into the world, from outcomes, which is how does the respondent, how did the participants in that activity change? How are they different? Do they have different attitudes, different perspectives? And those two are both relevant parts, and you can evaluate both parts. So for example, for the outputs, it might be that you will deliver an interactive experience. And so you can evaluate that with observation. You can count up how many times there are interactions between the presenter and the participants, or other kinds of things you can see objectively, is this happening? With the outcomes, you generally need to do something like a survey or interviews, because it's the outcome is happening inside people's brains or through discussion between participants. So you can't normally get at it purely from an objective observation standpoint.
So combining the both. Perfect. Bruno, I think you have more papers you wanted to share with us. You want to continue on the next one?
Yeah, sure. This second paper is more recent. It was published last year in Frontiers in Communication. It's by Ziegler et al. And it's called Evaluation of Science Communication, Current Practices, Challenges, and Future Implications. And I'm aware Eric Jensen knows this paper as well. It touches upon several subjects that you've already been discussing, actually, and perhaps we can go into a bit more detail in some of them. In this study, the authors gathered data from 3 sources. So they were looking at an online survey of around 100 or so German science communicators. They also did a systematic review of 55 impact evaluation reports that were publicly available, and several informal discussion rounds with science communication stakeholders in Germany. So based upon these data, the authors identify 3 main challenges that they say are challenges that come up consistently in impact evaluation initiatives. And I'm going to list them now. So the first one is lack of strategy. They note that there's often a lack of long-term planning, also that very often science communicators confuse or conflate the impact goals with the measurable project objectives. And this leads to a lack of precise definition of what they were aiming to do, and a lack of a precise definition of audiences. So this lack of strategy in general is kind of obfuscates the usefulness of the results. The second challenge is poor methodology. So sometimes it's due to lack of knowledge, and sometimes it's due to lack of resources. But in general, the authors noted that the methods that are chosen by science communicators to carry out impact evaluation are very often not scientifically valid, and they rely too heavily on self-reporting. They hardly ever include controls, and they don't often have comparative reference points, especially when you do a sort of pre-event and post-event analysis. There aren't these sort of checkpoints in between. So I imagine a lot of times this is due to what Eric was saying at the beginning. A lot of science communicators come from natural sciences backgrounds, and they don't come from the social sciences. So they're not trained in techniques like focus groups, survey design, that kind of stuff. But even when they might be able to employ someone else to do it, there might be a lack of resources or a lack of this strategic thinking to carry it out. And then the third challenge that the authors identify is a lack of learning outcomes from the impact evaluation. So first of all, very few impact evaluation reports are made public, and very often the process of impact evaluation is not transparent. In fact, the authors were complaining that the systematic review that they did only included 55 impact reports, because that's pretty much all they could find. Very often we do a report, but the report is just for our boss or our funder, so it never sees the light of day outside of our organization, and other people don't get a chance to learn from our mistakes. This can be because we don't want to, make ourselves, share our embarrassments or our failures in public. And very often they're just treated as internal documents, and they're not very transparent in the process. And in general, one of the things that kind of was the leitmotif or the running theme through all of these challenges was that us, science communicators, we tend to see the process of impact evaluation more as a telling success stories kind of activity. So we just want to share how well everything went, and look, we reached all these people, and this is how well it went, and this is why you should give me all this money next time to organize an event exactly like this one. And we don't often treat them as that learning opportunity that they could be. So the authors also have several specific recommendations for science communication practitioners. And obviously the first one is to start with strategic planning of impact evaluation. Don't leave it to the end. Don't just include it as an add-on report once you've finished. And very often they say that science communicators need to recognize that they might not have the in-house expertise to do this, and they need to collaborate with social science researchers who can carry out this kind of work. But also, there's an interesting sentence in the end of the paper. They say, there needs to be a discussion of what can be expected from meaningful evaluations conducted by practitioners, at which point external experts or researchers are appointed, and where do we draw the line between evaluation and research? So I think I really love, Eric, for you to pick up on this this question that they throw to the floor, because I think that's a really valid point. We can't be expected as practitioners to carry out research standard evaluation. Like, at some point, that's not just an internal report, that becomes a paper that could be published in some kind of social science journal. So where do you see the line between these two activities?
Yeah, I mean, it's all a matter of degree. So absolutely, I think we should be realistic about what science communication practitioners can do within the resources and the time and the training that they have. So that limit, though, is different for different practitioners in different institutions, in different funding contexts. So some science communication practitioners do have the resources and the time and the support that it could be done in a way that's kind of the ideal, which is what I have articulated in a previous paper on evidence-based science communication, which is a kind of integration of practice and research into something that in English is called praxis, where you bring together practice and research. That would be the ideal, or theory and practice. And in some cases, that is realistic. In other cases, the practitioners are just kind of having to go from project to project, activity to activity, and it's just not realistic to think they're going to have time to develop high quality evaluations. In those cases, I think we need to have shared metrics and measures that people can just pull off the shelf and use. So we have started making efforts in this direction in some projects to make these kinds of resources available for practitioners to be able to just borrow evaluation tools and use them. They're not going to be perfect. They're not going to be kind of exactly ideal for their activity, but they'll be like a kind of 90% solution. And that's already a lot better than the current situation. But it's a system-wide issue. So if you are not expected to do high quality evaluations, if you're not rewarded for doing them, then why would you invest the time and resource in doing it? It's just not a realistic thing to think that if the incentives in the system are not there, that people will invest that time and effort. So this is something that starts with funders of science communication activities, and then kind of you have to look at every level from there. So it's a big issue. The question, the final element about the line between evaluation and research is a much easier question to answer, because that's an established definitional thing, that evaluation is when you have specific objectives. So it's like a narrow focus. With research, it's more open. So research is a wider, more open activity, whereas evaluation is more focused. But the methods are largely the same. They're both social science research methods, and they're both potentially something that could be done scientifically and has a kind of range of quality from low quality to high quality.
Now that you were mentioning kind of these off-the-shelf kind of solutions, do we have any rule of thumbs for what constitutes as good impact evaluation? How do we identify between good and bad evaluation processes or methods in general?
Yeah, I mean, I have seen so many bad impact evaluations that it takes less than a minute when I'm looking through an evaluation report or a survey design to see, like, okay, is this going to be a plausibly good impact evaluation, or is it just going to be not worth reading further? So the hallmarks of good impact evaluation, the things, the indicators, are clear objectives for the impact evaluation. So it's actually clear what it's measuring. And then the survey design, because most of these impact evaluations are done with surveys. So the survey design is the thing that immediately stands out. And it actually doesn't cost any more time or resource to do an impact evaluation with a bad survey design than with a good survey design. They both cost the same effort. They both use participants' time the same. It's just that good impact evaluation with high quality survey questions actually yields accurate results that you can use, whereas bad survey design just is kind of a waste of everybody's time, and it's useless. Which is why I feel like there's a kind of ambivalence when I address the issue that was mentioned in this paper of a lack of sharing of impact reports, because such a high percent of science communication impact evaluations are done with terrible survey designs. I feel a kind of mixed feeling about them being shared, because actually having more of them shared doesn't necessarily make things better in terms of people being able to learn. It's kind of just more noise in the system. So it's a really difficult situation that we're in now, where so much of the evaluation practice is done with poor quality instruments that it's questionable whether they should be shared without some kind of quality assurance mechanism in order to kind of separate the good and bad quality. And that separation is not something that kind of is something that I've invented. It's there's well-established practices. There's decades of research about what makes a good survey question and how you can accurately draw out people's perspectives. So these are things that, as a social scientist, I've been trained for many years in designing good survey questions and setting up appropriate interview guides, and how do you analyze data in a way that follows good practices. All of these things are things that I'm like deeply steeped in, but I fully appreciate that for people that haven't had that background, it's a really challenging situation. Just like if I tried to step into designing an astronomy research protocol, I would really struggle. So I do understand it's a difficult circumstance, but we do have to be realistic about the kind of limitations of, you know, that if you have had 0 days, 0 hours of training in survey design, you probably shouldn't be putting surveys out into the field.
To move on, we actually are going to comment next on a paper about audiences. So I know that we have a question regarding this, Bruno, is it right?
Yeah, we do. Maybe I can comment a bit on the paper and then throw in the question.
Perfect.
Does that sound okay? So this last paper we wanted to comment on is investigating diversity in European audiences for public engagement with research, with the question, who attends European Researchers' Night in Ireland, the UK, and Malta? Eric Jensen is also co-author on this paper, which was published last year. And this is a study of survey participants, the use survey methods and participants attending public engagement events of the European Researchers' Night in 7 cities across Ireland, Malta, and the UK. So the authors here set out with 2 hypotheses, and these were based on prior findings from the wider literature about audiences who attend public engagement with science events. And the hypotheses were that 1, there would be an overrepresentation of highly educated people, and 2, that there would be an overrepresentation of white people, that is, compared to the general population. Curiously, the first hypothesis was confirmed, so attendees had a higher level of academic qualification than the general public, but the second hypothesis was not, so there wasn't an underrepresentation of ethnic minorities compared to the general population. And this paper actually falls in line with others that analyze audience data, and they illustrate a similar point, and that is that outreach events often disproportionately attract educated, privileged audiences. And this is something that we touched upon in the first Journal Club event of this month about inclusivity and diversity. We were discussing this fact that science communication does have a bit of a problem with preaching to the converted. And I have one question for you, Eric, which is this an issue of not looking at the data or not knowing how to address it, maybe? And before you answer that, actually, I'm going to throw in our other question from the audience, and maybe you can tackle both at once. We have a question that says, what is the role of audience segmentation in impact evaluation?
Yeah, I mean, that one's not directly related for my my answer to this. So on the issue of kind of audience diversity and inclusion, there is a very well-established pattern, but there is also a lot of denial in science communication practice. So I remember very well my first science festival evaluation, where I had these very clear kinds of findings about there being a very disproportionate skew of people who are highly educated, well off, actually more than in this paper in that case. And there was just the practitioner just they didn't want to deal with it. It was just kind of too big of a problem, and it would have required too much of a rethink of their kind of way of doing business in getting participants for science communication activities. So the core expected, like what you would expect if you do outreach where you kind of send information out through university networks, you post information around existing science communication institutions, then you would expect to get the already converted coming to events. And that is exactly what happens disproportionately in events. The way that you get a diverse audience is that you have to really be active in going out and inviting people to participate. So I've done an impact evaluation of an outreach activity where they did successfully bring people who were kind of, in that case, it was museums. They brought people in who were not kind of already converted, and it required them going to where they were, where that community was, and explicitly inviting them and kind of scaffolding their experience. So giving them kind of an experience that was not exactly the same as the kind of traditional way of doing public engagement, but kind of welcoming them, giving them a soft landing into the experience.
Right.
So that's what's required to actually get diverse audiences in. The question about audience segmentation. So there is an interest in using audience segmentation, which is where you classify your audience, you place them into different types, into different categories. And I have published quite a while ago about the problems with this kind of approach. I mean, what normally happens is that you kind of lump people together. So you say, like, we have, young explorers and the urban elite, like you kind of put these labels on people. And normally the way that that's done is that you take continuous data. So, this person is more urban than the next person, but it's only like a matter of degree. You kind of take out all the nuance and you just put them into a box. And in doing that, you're kind of reducing the information you have about them down to something that's oversimplified to the point that it's inaccurate. And doing so is problematic, both methodologically, but also it can be an engine of further exclusion for people. The defense I've heard of segmentation is that it can help practitioners to recognize the differences in their audiences, that it's not all one audience. But I would hope that everybody can kind of just assume that not everybody is the same in their audience, that we can kind of just all take that as a starting assumption and then try to have an accurate understanding of who the audiences are.
I associate the word segmentation, with digital marketing and online communications especially. So is that something that also applies to offline communications and maybe census data and stuff like that?
Well, yeah, I mean, where segmentation has been used is, like, for example, museums in the UK use segmentation models that have been provided by market research companies. They're all really questionable, the models that are used. There are some that come from academic literature. That's the ones that I was critiquing in a paper with Emily Dawson about 11 years ago, is an academic segmentation model. So there is interest in taking the marketing model of segmentation and using it in the context of science communication and public engagement. And I have strongly argued against that approach. Where it does make sense to use segmentation is where it was originally developed, which is for marketing. Because in marketing, your ability to improve, to achieve lift, like a higher percent of people that will click on your product or go to your activity compared to if you just randomly throw out your advertising, that's the marker of success for a segmentation model in marketing. But if you try to transfer that over to public engagement, science communication, just kind of ramping up attendance by going to more of the people who are already going to your event, that's a really questionable thing to do, especially if it's a publicly funded public engagement activity. So it's actually kind of the exact opposite of what you should be doing, which is if you're already getting tons of people who are really keen on science already and highly educated and well off, just getting more of those people, which is what you would do if you're just trying to sell tickets, is an ethically dubious thing to do for public engagement.
Perfect. Thanks so much, Eric and Bruno. I think it's time to start wrapping up today's event. To summarize, based on the conversation that we've had, I think it's quite clear that we can only win by paying attention to the impact of our science communication activities. Not only does it help us to improve our work and engage our audiences better, I think it would also add meaningfulness to our activities. And in order to decide on relevant methods for measuring the impact of our science communication activities or outreach events or awareness raising campaigns on social media, whatever it is that we're talking about, we need to think of the outcomes and the impact that we want to achieve in our audiences and put in place clear objectives. And being transparent about our goals enables us to focus our actions and monitor our success. And however, it's really important that we also acknowledge that impact isn't necessarily only positive, as we've discussed today, and that our activities might have results that are actually damaging for our public engagement goals. So we should be very mindful about this possibility. And this information is, of course, very useful for us as well, because if we're able to track where we've gone wrong, we have the possibility of changing the course of our actions and improving them in the future. So Eric, any final recommendations or takeaway messages for our audience?
I think my top tip is to be very specific about the impact that you want to have for your audiences, and take a few minutes at least to think about, is the way that you're doing this communication activity the best option to get to that specific kind of impact?
Perfect. Thank you so much, Eric, for joining us. I'm going to leave you with a message from Bruno about our next event.
Thank you for joining us in this special episode, and stay tuned to the Journal Club newsletter to find out about next month's topic. If you still have any questions, please drop them on Twitter and send them to us. We can still discuss this topic over the coming weeks. If you have any requests for what episodes you would like us to discuss before the summer, now is the time to let us know. So thank you very much, and see you soon.